Good morning, Susie. How are you? Thank you. Good morning. How are you? Yeah, I know. Yeah. Tell me what you did. I did there. You did. Seriously, I had one day. Oh my gosh, we got huge. Yes, you got. It's mine. First of all, we have sweetie. It has more than 86. Oh, yeah, there's one in front of it. And they have. Yeah. Yeah, at least it's that maybe you'll get your back. Got it. Okay. Okay. You get a point back there. Shall we? Shall we have your surgery?
Thanks for asking. Yeah, I'm pretty light sensitive. I've got my movie star sunglasses. So I'm probably going to be wearing those during class. And
Did everything go okay?
it went okay, yeah. And I saw that I read better than most people one day after, and of course, reading. I can't live without reading, so that was good to hear. But everything is still a little blurry. Another week I'll be fine. And he told me I can start dancing again next week for my second surgery. So thank you for asking. I sent an email to everybody to thank them for their prayers.
Well, yeah. Anita, can you hear me?
I can hear there's no transcription though.
Oh, okay. Let's see here.
It says the closed captions there, but there's the option for transcriptions not here.
Oh, okay. All right, Boker Tov, everybody. Good to see you. Apparently the bagels are on their way. So apropos of the bagels, wait, hold on just 1 second. Anita, you can see the caption there is on. But I wonder if, doesn't usually
Yeah,
show
I
up
can,
on
the captions there, the transcription isn't, but the captions just are showing now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, here's. Fancy. All right, so bagel. Apropos bagel. I mentioned on Saturday morning that we are making an effort, a concerted effort to inspire more of our congregants, including you, to come to Saturday morning services after Torah. So thanks to Mel made a wonderful suggestion about, you remember what you suggested about at the end of the services, you need to have food to get more people to come. So we are going to do this. We're going to have we're going to make a practice of having a light kiddush after services with some bagels and fruit and coffee and and cream cheese that we can eat at the end of services together before we head off on our way. And I want to invite your generosity to help us make it possible. Of course, it does cost us a little bit of money to have the kiddush. Already have a couple of people who have stepped forward to offer their sponsorship. But if you'd like to, please let me know so that we can, and we don't have to do that now, but you can just approach me separately and let me know so that we can make a kiddush, a light kiddush possible for our Shabbat mornings. So thank you. And of course, hope you will come to Shabbat mornings. All right, so we're going to pick up that my hope is today, I think today we will finish up our discussion of the Birkat Tahlit. We've been there for a while now because we spent a time with our friend Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. And now we're going to look at something from a response from the Reform movement on the same question of women and Talit, just to see like how our movement approaches things differently. Obviously, the conclusion from the Reform movement is different from the one that Feinstein gives us, but what's more important, and I've learned this in my studies of legal theory, what's more important in reading legal texts, like court opinions and so forth, is not so much the bottom line ruling, although that's important, but what's even more important than the bottom line decision is the argumentation and the way the ultimate ruling is laid out and argued and justified, because it's through that discourse that the community is shaped. It's the authors are teaching us how to think about particular issues, what values are important in considering them, what are not important. It's an invitation to read a legal text as an invitation by the author to enter into their vision of the community as it ought to be. So we saw that from Feinstein. He said a woman should not wear a talit, but that's almost secondary to the arguments that he made about why, right? He envisions a society that has very clear, a community that has very clear gender roles, that upholds what he believes to be the divine natural order of things, that men and women have specific role vis-a-vis the family and the Torah and everything. And that's where he's coming from. So we're going to look at the Reform movement's discussion of the same topic. Let's start with our blessing. Baruch atah all right, so let me get this up on the screen. This responsum was written in 1970, about the same time as Feinstein's. Feinstein's was 2 years later, but in the same era. Remember, the era was the era of the feminist movement, really the early period of the feminist movement. And the author of this responsum is Rabbi Solomon Freehoff. He was a prominent Reform rabbi during this period. He was a rabbi in Pittsburgh and served as the chairman of the CCAR Responsa Committee for probably 30 years or so. The Responsa Committee in our movement, this enterprise of answering questions of practice and Jewish law and so forth, works a little differently than it does in the Orthodox world. So what we saw in New York, and we saw in reading Rabbi Feinstein, we saw an example of how things work in the Orthodox world, where nobody is kind of appointed by any organization or so to make decisions. Authorities in Jewish law emerge in a community on the basis of their reputations for learning and prestige and charismatic authority, and then people look to them for answers. So Rabbi Feinstein played that role, among others, but he's the most prominent in the 20th century in the Orthodox world. Nobody appointed him the decider, but people began to look to him because of his reputation for deep knowledge and scholarship. In the Reform movement, it's a little different. We in Reform Judaism do have an institutional body. It's called, hey guys. Good, hey Steve. Steve's not in here, sorry. It's called the Responsa Committee of the CCAR. The CCAR is the Reform Rabbis Association. And we have a committee whose job it is to receive questions from, usually they come from rabbis or congregations about an issue of practice or what Judaism might say about a particular thing. And the Responsa Committee then, guys, the Responsa Committee will produce an answer. And then that response is similar to what Rabbi Feinstein writes, but it's produced officially by the Reform Group. All right, so here we're going to look at the response by Rabbi Freehoff for the Responsa Committee in 1970 on the topic of woman wearing a tallit. Okay, so here's the question posed to the committee. In some of our congregations, it is the custom that whoever comes up to the pulpit to participate in the service puts on a tallit. In young people's services for our high schools, boys and girls participate, and often the girl puts on the tallit at that occasion. According to Jewish law and tradition, is it proper for a girl to wear a tallit at a service? Now, notice one thing, this is going to give us an answer. Of course, Freehoff is going to say yes. We know that now, we take it for granted. And in part because of, Freehoff, the way he answers the question and teaches us to think, it comes to be a norm. But I want you to also see that a way in which our Reform Judaism kind of contrasts with Orthodox is that a question like this was a reasonable question to ask in 1970. Nobody in Reform Judaism would ask this question today. Right? I mean, it's settled, like it's just not even an issue. Not so, in in Orthodoxy, the nature of even the questions that are raised. In the different communities of practice are different. And we ended last week's session when I talked about, or I think it was maybe on the Saturday Torah study, we're talking about the concept of the interpretive community of Stanley Fish. The idea that an interpretive community is a community of people who, consciously or not, share a certain set of basic assumptions and values that we bring to bear in reading our texts. So we in Reformed Judaism would study the Torah and our traditions, and it would never even occur to us at this point whether, that a woman wearing a tallit would be an issue of controversy. Because we have a common set of assumptions that teach us to read the tradition. Whereas in another interpretive community, an Orthodox interpretive community, that would be a matter of great controversy. They would read the text different. Okay, all right, so now.
Want to just say one thing?
Can you project loudly? So-
Yes, it's fine, it's strict. Use the word settle. Settle, I'm not a lawyer, but settle law, that everybody agrees. No one even made, but you know what? It's not the case anymore. People raise things, they want to discuss it again. And what rights we have, we have to protect what we're getting at. Nothing is really settled. We have to sort of remind ourselves and
Well, that's true.
affirm the rights.
From time to time, when boundaries are questioned. In this, when boundaries are questioned, so for instance, the big one that was dealt with in our country recently was Roe v. Wade, the question of abortion. So that was decided in 1973, and some people argued, all right, it's over, it's settled, but that was definitely not the mood in the country, right? It was divided. The country's been divided for a long time, so it resurfaced and was, redecided. This issue of women wearing a tallit in Reformed Judaism is definitely a settled issue. There's no discontent within the community of practice over this issue. So I would not envision that somebody would ask, after 60 years since Rabbi Freehoff's response, we feel it's time to revisit the question of women wearing a tallit. Nobody's gonna ask that, right? So leaders, your question, Nell, begs another important one, or raises another important issue, which is for leaders in deciding issues. Is not only to read the sources, the texts and apply them, but there's also a reading of the community, that has to be involved. My teacher, Rabbi David Ellenson, who's a historian of Halakha and writes about this, describes responsa, this issue of question and answers, the genre of question and answers, as the place where text meets context. Okay, which I think is a really good way to think of it. And there's a principle in the Talmud that says community leaders, rabbis, etc., should not make decisions or institute policies that the community itself cannot follow. Okay, so just to make rules, like read a text and say this is the rule, absent any consideration of where your community is on the question and so forth, is a recipe for disaster. Okay, Courtney.
Do you think that, there's always this, you always have two forces, if you will. You always have people with their own ideologies, whether it's politics, whatever it is. And there's going to be people who don't agree with you. And perhaps instead of in the judicial court, the judge there being, okay, we decide this, we decide that, instead of judge, we're looking to God to decide what we should do. It's like a universal good that I think most people would want. I don't know.
Yeah, but yes, however, we're not looking to God to decide it, and that's actually an important principle too in Judaism and in the enterprise of interpretation. It goes back to a passage in the Talmud where the story is told. This group of sages are arguing over a particular issue of Jewish law. It happens to be the question of whether a certain oven is kosher. Doesn't really matter, but that's the subject matter that they're arguing over. And the preponderance of the group, all of them except for one, say the oven is kosher, let's say. And then there's one, Rabbi Eliezer, who says it's not. And Rabbi Eliezer said, kind of says, if I'm right, let these such and such miracles happen, and they keep happening, and the majority isn't convinced. And then finally, the story says a voice came from heaven, voice of God said, Rabbi Eliezer is right on this matter. But then one of the sages, Rabbi Yehoshua, is in the majority, steps up to God and says, God, you taught us, the Torah says, it's no longer in heaven. In other words, God gave us the Torah and gave it to us to interpret and apply. And God's response to Rabbi Yehoshua is, you know what, you're right. That is what I say. So we don't look specifically to God to issue, decisions. We look to the community leaders. But then, and because God empowered the community to make those decisions. Now, again, within our respective Jewish communities, that enterprise of decision-making is different. Who gets to make those? And Rabbi Feinstein's community, it's very strictly understood that only people like Rabbi Feinstein get to make those decisions. People who are understood to be learned in Torah and halakha and so forth, and who people ask questions to and they make answers. And then the rest of the community has to follow their decisions. Remember, he said, no one can, ordinary people can't just come along and say, like, I feel like changing the Torah and do that. Whereas in our community practice, Reform Judaism is based on the principle of individual autonomy, meaning each individual person has ultimate authority over their own selves. And our religious philosophy is that each of us has the right to make our decisions and interpret as we choose. So those are very different forms of authority, and that lead to very different ways of living. Okay, all right, so let's get into Rabbi Freehoff. So Freehoff, because our Reform Judaism is based on individual autonomy, Freehoff writes from a different position than Feinstein does. Feinstein is making a decision that is binding on his community. Freehoff is making a decision that is in no way binding on his community. This is strictly persuasive writing. This is an advisory opinion. Okay, so you see how he deals with it. The commandment to wear a talit with fringes is based on Numbers 15, which we studied. Upon the basis of this commandment, the anonymous Baraita teaching in the Talmud says that women too are in duty bound to wear the garment with fringes. However, something that Feinstein did not mention. However, Rabbi Simon says there that they are free from that obligation. Remember that women are exempt, not prohibited, but exempt. He bases his opinion upon the fact that scripture in the passage of Numbers uses the phrase, you shall see them and remember, etc. Since scripture says you shall see them, that proves that the proper time for talit and tzitzit is the daytime, not the nighttime. We learn this. This conclusion puts the commandment to wear fringes into the special class of positive commandments limited by time. And it is a general rule that women are free from the obligation to fulfill positive commandments that are dependent upon time. Of course, being free from the obligation to fulfill the commandment of fringes does not mean that they are forbidden to wear them. It means only that they are not in duty bound to wear them. That's an important distinction that Freehoff makes here. that Feinstein doesn't. We saw Feinstein says, he says, in effect, that the exemption equals prohibition. Because women have to tend to the children, that's more important than wearing the fringes. Right? Whereas Freehoff says, it's just an exemption. They don't have to wear them, but they can. Okay, when the law is discussed in the Shulchan Aruch, which is the later code of Jewish law, the author Joseph Caro says, following Rabbi Simon in the Talmud, that women and slaves, nice that women and slaves are put in the same category, they are in the Holocaust. Women and slaves are free from putting on the fringes since it is a commandment based on time. But Israelis, a commentator on Shulchan Aruch, adds, at all events, if they wish to put on the fringed garment and even recite the blessing over it, they are free to do so, as is the case with all time-limited positive commandments. That is, they are not compelled to obey, but they are permitted to do so if they wish. However, he adds, if they do put it on, it would appear to be a show of extra pride of piety. Yohara, this is an interesting kind of category that once you learn it, I think like I can't unthink it when I see it, which is the idea is like Yohara is like a show off. Okay, it's like somebody who's making like shows of being extra religious. You know, you might see that from time to time, and people it's like, ooh, they're trying to show this thing. Okay, so he's quoting here from a medieval author. It says like a woman could put on a talit. It's not forbidden from doing so. However, she might look like a show off. Okay. But if they are not to put it on because it would look like a show of extra pride or piety on their part, then it becomes necessary to explain the fact that women observe the commandment of the lulav and recite blessings. Is not the lulav also a positive commandment limited by time? Good question. The explanation of this difference is given by the Magen David, a medieval commentator, that the lulav is a stricter commandment than the one concerning fringes, because if a person does not have a square garment, the fringes must be on the corners of a four-cornered garment. Remember, we talked about that too. He need not put fringes on at all. So we discussed this. The mitzvah of the fringes applies not to the person per se, it applies to the garment. You're only obligated to have the fringes if you have a four-cornered garment. If you don't have one, the fringes don't apply. It's true that it is now our custom always to wear a talit katan with the four corners and fringes. That's the undershirt with the fringe. Nevertheless, according to law, it is only if a man has a four-cornered garment that he must put the fringes on. In other words, the obligation depends on the garment. But with regard to the lulav, a man must get a lulav and say the blessings. In this case, the obligation is incumbent upon the man himself, the person himself, not on whether he has the object. He must get it, he asks. And that's a nuanced distinction, but an important in understanding the law. Okay, now let's move over here. One of the later deciders, Yehiel Epstein, is Aruch HaShulchan, it's 19th century, says that we should not allow women to put on the fringe talit. But then Epstein has the problem of explaining why women bless the lulav and formally eat the matzah at the seder, which are positive commandments limited by time. He explains by saying that these positive time-limited commandments come only once a year, but the talit should be worn every day. However, all the great and earlier authorities permit it. The only question that seems to divide the earlier authorities, none of whom doubts the right of women to put on the talit. That's interesting, right? Freehoff is telling us that even in the medieval texts, the leaders, no one said that it's forbidden to do it. They said women can if they want. Some raise the question of maybe it's like kind of a show off thing, but nevertheless they could if they want. It's only later that someone like Feinstein comes along and says it's prohibited. Why? Because he's reacting against the feminist movement. right? Which is perceived by him as a threat, not because they're gonna wear talit tov, but because of what that symbolizes. The breakdown in the gender roles and the construct of society. Right, so he asserts a prohibition where none really exists. It's a sociological boundary maintenance kind of thing, more so than a strict reading of the texts. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So Freehoff is saying here, no one, the earlier authorities don't even doubt the right of women to put on the talit. Okay, so the only question that seems to divide the earlier authorities is the question as to whether when a woman puts on the talit, she may make the regular blessing. Why would that be an issue? We say a blessing when we put on the talit. Howard?
Blessing, we're reciting that God has commanded us to wear the tzitzit,
Right,
and well, did God command the woman?
exactly, right, okay, so the blessing that shared each other b'mitzvot kametzimanu lehitatef batzitzi. God sanctified us with commandments, commanded us to wear the fringes. So the halakhic question would be, should a woman say that if she in fact is not commanded, if she's allowed, but not commanded, different status, okay? There is a full discussion of this problem in the Tosafot to Rosh Hashanah, that's also medieval. This Tosafot, this comment, is mainly the opinion of Rabbi Stoller. The discussion is on the general principle of whether anyone, such as women and the blind, who is free from the obligation to fulfill positive commandments limited by time, should, when he fulfills such commandments voluntarily, pronounce the blessing over them or not. The Tosefet, the teaching, is based mainly on the discussion in Bava Kama, that's the Talmud, where Rabbi Joseph, who was blind, had voluntarily fulfilled such commandments as he was not obligated to fulfill. So, just a side note about this halakha, that blind people are exempt from certain mitzvot too, because they can't see what they're doing. So for instance, the mitzvot in respect to the Seder, think about like in the Passover Seder. And when we're having a Seder, and the leader will say, like, point to the, the items on the Seder, like, this is the matzah, this is the halakha says a blind person can't do that, because they can't see it. Okay, so they're exempt from the mitzvah. But he's saying there's a Talmudic passage that says there was a blind sage who did the mitzvot even though he didn't have to, because he was exempt, and he would still say the blessing. Okay, see also this one in the Talmud, Michal, where the Tosefet, the teaching, discusses the statement in the Talmud that Michal, the daughter of King Saul, used to put on tefillin. That's already, that's like a biblical idea, read in the Middle Ages. But again, you didn't hear Feinstein saying anything about this. But this is in the medieval texts that King Saul's daughter used to put on tefillin. Incidentally, has anybody read the novels Rashi's Daughters?
Yeah.
Yeah, if you haven't read them, they're really good. I recommend them. The author is Maggie Anton. She wrote a series, there's 3 of them, I think, or 4 in the series, called Rashi's Daughters. And they're fiction, but they're based very heavily on passages from the Talmud and so forth. And where she talks about the lives of the daughters of Rashi, great medieval commentator, teachers, etc. And there's a tradition that Rashi taught his daughters to wear tefillin, which is also a positive time-bound commandment. Okay, not commanded, but still could do. Okay, and the wife of Jonah used to make the festival pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Okay, again, a positive time-bound. Both of these were positive time-bound. Rabbeinu Tam holds the opinion that women may pronounce the blessing over the fringe talit. That's interesting. Rabbi Tam is a very prominent medieval authority. He says a woman can say the blessing and wear the talit, but Maimonides says that women must put on the fringes if they wish. Women may put on the fringes if they wish, yet may not say the blessing. He adds, so with all the other positive commandments that women are free from. If they wish to fulfill them without reciting the blessings, we do not prevent them. The Hagahot Maimonides, that's a later commentary on Maimonides, says in the name of Rashi that he too was opposed to their reciting the blessing. So the law is clear enough. One authority believes that a woman is actually in duty bound to wear the fringes. All agree that she may wear them if she wishes to, except for the limitation that it might look like the pride of extra piety. This solitary objection can hardly apply to the young women if we put the talit upon them. They would simply consider it part of the ceremony. Besides, in our Reform movement, where special emphasis is placed upon the religious equality of men and women, there can be no real objection to young women. So there we go. Okay. Putting on the talit when they participate in this. Okay, so that's his answer. Now, I think were someone to write a response for the Reform movement today on this question, how might you imagine it would look different than what we just read? Would it look different? If a Reform rabbi today wrote a response on the question of women wearing. Courtney.
I don't think it would be as great, like, yeah,
Can you? speak
sorry,
up?
I don't think it'd be as great as
I, right, it's like I was saying before, I mean, it would definitely not be an issue. You know,
What to do, or, you know,
yeah,
it's not, it's a little bit more free.
yeah, more free flowing, okay, so if someone were to write one today. Surely the conclusion would be the same. I mean, in essence, that it's not a problem for women to wear a talit. Might it, remember what I said before, that what's more important than the bottom line conclusion in a text like this is the argumentation that makes the case. How might the case, if we were to make it today, look different than this one? Stuart.
Well, I think instead of dealing with the specific issue of the talit, I think that the approach would be one of equality, that whatever a person is required to do would apply to all people.
Yeah.
And whatever options people have would apply to all, so that would be a general concept. And from that, you could deal with all the different mitzvot.
Right, yeah, I would agree with that. So today, we would take a much stronger stance on gender egalitarian. Whereas Freehoff says, it's the last thing that he says in his response. He says, like, plus we place emphasis on the equality, so it's really not a problem, is how he puts it. But that was in 1970. Today, I would expect it would, full-throated. There is no distinction between men and women in terms of religious practice that we make. We hold gender egalitarianism as a core value. And and anyone who wishes to put on a talit in our community, man or woman, is absolutely invited to do something, that nature. Vicky,
I'm sorry, I don't know if you covered this, but
can you speak up?
I don't know if you just said this, excuse me, but I think a sentence, some declaration that there is no difference, that there are no restrictions on women.
Exactly,
And I think that would be clearly stated.
I agree. Yeah, Lee,
There was reference
to the blind person, that a blind person doesn't need to do that. I think that in this day and age, that those who have vision problems or otherwise often try to participate really as very much as they can. And so I think that would be open as opposed to, well, they don't have to do, it's like, don't tell us we don't have to, we want.
Well, yeah, that is an interesting issue about the have to versus want to. Okay, so and regardless of how it's, whether it's a blind person or a woman or a man or anyone. Feinstein certainly speaks in the language of have to. Freehoff also does a little bit in terms of making distinctions between have to and want to. I'm not sure how it would go in a responsive of 2023 on this question or anything else, but I think that thinking about how, the response that our movement produces these days, I think the language around have to and want to would be more nuanced and more ambiguous. In effect, Reform Judaism has arrived at a place today where everything is about want to, nothing is about have to. You see what I mean? And that's where, and this is something that makes an interesting distinction between the Reform movement's discussion of women in comparison with the conservative movement's discussion. So the conservative movement is also, with minor exceptions in some places, but in the main, in the conservative movement today is also gender egalitarian, in every bit as much as the Reform. They have women clergy, when women can do everything in the service that men do. There's really no distinction in conservative Judaism. In that way, we're the same. But the issue of mitzvah is different. So whereas in the Reform movement today, we speak about this issue of like anybody who we make no distinctions between men and women. Anyone who wants to do a particular thing can absolutely do it. Whereas in the conservative movement, they have a great response that was written just a few years ago about the role of women in Judaism. They speak about women as being obligated in the mitzvah in the same way that men are. That's the difference.
That's the conservative.
Yes, in the conservative. So they've moved in and said, it's not that women are just exempt, but they should be able to do what they want. They have actually said that women are obligated to wear the talit just like men are. Okay, Howard.
There's another legal principle called judicial restraint, where you only answer the question that's put before you. You
Yeah.
don't anticipate the question that may come along in the next case.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking of that in relation to issues relating to gender orientation and gender fluidity. The Reform movement is very much committed to these issues, to allowing people to express themselves sexually and in their gender as they feel.
Yeah.
And so I wonder to what extent an opinion today would get into those issues. Would not only talk about men and women being equal, but would talk about the fact that people express themselves sexually in different ways, that that they change their genders in various ways, wholly or partly, and therefore, we're not gonna make these distinctions. And to
Yeah.
take it one step further,
Yeah.
by doing that, the reform movement removes all discussion. Oh, well, is that person a man or is that person a woman?
Yeah.
The orthodox, and it sounds possibly even conservative, are still trapped in the distinction of, wait a minute, is this person who just walked in the door a man or a woman? Do they sit there or do they sit there?
Well, that would be true for orthodoxy. It wouldn't be true for conservative.
Right.
But, yeah, the question of the gender fluid, so the reform movement, and I'm pretty sure the conservative movement also has a responsum on the issue of transgender. It's written, I don't know, maybe like 15 years ago, 10 years ago. And when you read it now, it's already like, I mean, like, it speaks about, it doesn't speak about transgender, it speaks about transsexual. Which nobody says anymore, because that has a certain valence to it, you know, that has to do with the biological elements and that response on the trans, about, it deals with like, I'm trying to, I think like ultimately it makes distinctions based on like, has a surgery taken place to like create a sex change? Remember how like we used to talk about like a sex change operation? Right? So that like a person, so the response at that time would say like, somebody would be like, if somebody who was born as a man would be a woman, like once they had a sex change operation, then they would be considered a woman in all respects. But these days, that's no longer sufficient, and you know, for the way lots of people are thinking. You know, so I don't know if there's been an updated, I don't recall that there's been an updated one yet, but surely it's coming, because like Howard, you're saying, I mean, you're staking out some territory, but the world changes so much, so frequently, and Reform Judaism is very committed ideologically to, you know, embracing and harmonizing with the changing landscape of modernity, whereas Orthodoxy, like we saw with Feinstein, says it doesn't matter, the world can change however it wants. The Torah is the Torah.
Right.
Those are very different approaches to the world. Right? Embodied in different interpretive communities. So let's see, Shelley's line of hand, and then Mel. Go ahead, Shelley.
So I have a question about reform responsa. I can't remember. And going back to your original question of how this might be different today. And so, of course, in 1972, I believe that was the year, or maybe the year before, Sally Priesand became the first woman rabbi.
Right, so-
I was writing this when really the only leadership that women had at the time, that I think is sisterhood, you know, the sisterhood. And even there, I remember at BJBE, the sisterhood referred themselves as to the little board, and the temple board was called the big board. And that was at BJBE. I don't know about anywhere else, but so fast forward to today, where of course we don't use that. And you've got all these examples of leadership by women, including so many women rabbis, leaders in minyanim services, Shiva minyanim, all this stuff. So my question is, in a reform responsa, where the culture is ahead of maybe a question, can the responsa refer to that, or is it strictly looking at text that from Jewish tradition?
Yeah, not strictly looking at, no response is strictly looking at text. That's That's what, where Ellenson says that the response are the grounds where text meets context.
Right.
It's always happening either explicitly or implicit. In reform responsa, it tends to be more explicit. So reform as a genre of writing, reform responsa will talk about the texts and then say, and here's what we know, here's what we know from modern science, and here's what's happening in the culture and so forth, and we take all of that into consideration. In Rabbi Feinstein's response, he also did make mention of the context when he talked about the movement of the smug and self-important women, right, the feminist movement. But the way he writes and what's common of Orthodox responsa is they tend not to make mention of extra halakhic factors as factors in their decision. So even because in their interpretive community, things that are going on in the culture and so forth they're not relevant to the halakha. The halakha is a closed internal system, that by which decisions are made. So they'll write, as Feinstein did, in a way that refers only to the text, but he did give you a hint that he's being influenced by things other than text when he talked about the feminist. Now notice that he, in his response, he didn't say anything about these medieval sources that talk about women wearing a towel. Freehoff referred to them, they're in the Talmud, right there, Feinstein knows that. But he didn't reference them. Okay, where he's making an argument that the Torah is clear. Women do not do this. But we know from reading Freehoff that, well, the Torah isn't exactly so clear. So all of this is contextual writing. It's text meets context, and it's effort, and it's community leaders making argumentation to shape the community the way that they believe is best. Susan.
I think the reason that Feinstein perhaps did not refer to the medieval practices, because people often don't refer to ideas that don't fit their mold.
Yeah, that's true.
So he left that out because he had his strict mold.
Yeah, that's right. Do you see that in other cases, writers are responsible will make mention of positions that disagree with that, but they'll demonstrate why those positions are not relevant to the present question, or why they're a minority view or something like that. Ultimately, this is argumentation, it's persuasive writing. Okay. All right, yeah, let's talk later. Beth-El.
So Rabbi, we're talking a lot about Feinstein.
Yeah,
I'm very intrigued with, talking about basically his argument is women have a lot to do in the home and they're excused from, certain mitzvahs, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm wondering,
a little further.
more than
Then they may not do this because it would take them away from their duties at home.
so I'm wondering how it's Feinstein, he comes home, the rabbi comes home, and his wife, the mother of his children, want to do things a certain way, right?
Uh,
So does she have more authority than Feinstein in the home? Because it seems to me that, I don't know, it's kind of general equality, 50-50. But I don't know how this goes back community, whether the mother, she has the primary decision maker is your wife in your home. And whether that has changed, before Judaism, like everything is 50-50, as opposed to, you got my drift, right? Yeah, it's cultural.
It is, that's right, they're different cultures. Yeah, I don't know how Rabbi Feinstein's home was. But I mean, you know, he definitely gives this sense that like, the way he sees the world is that. Women have their domain, men have their domain. This is very clear. It's ordained by God this way. And that, it's our responsibility to uphold that, not to start renegotiating the terms and redefining because the broader culture says. Okay, Nina, go ahead.
I mean, I find this whole discussion to be just so fascinating, and I'm going to go back to a couple of things that you said before about the idea that you have to, that decisions are made not necessarily based upon the effect that it'll have now, but the effect that it could have on the future and future interpretations. And you know, it kind of, it has nothing to do with one another, but it kind of does. It reminds me kind of the idea of people who don't want to change gun laws. And they bring up the fact that they don't want to change things, not that they don't think that these automatic weapons are a good thing, but the concern is if you stop that, then what's going to happen after that? Then there's a possibility that you're going to take away my right to have any kind of gun in my house. And it's then I want to bring this to where we are now, and then our temple, which is the only context that I have, having grown up here and then served as leadership in the temple. We have a committee called the Ritual Committee. And if there are changes that are going to be made, they need to be brought before the Ritual Committee. And on the committee, there are at least, and this was a number of years ago, but there were those who very much saw our temple as being the bastion of classical reform. And that any decision that we would make that would kind of change what they saw as being classical reform, they wanted to protect that. You know, and so, and then there were people who felt like, well, they really, you know, we don't want it to seem like we're demanding people to do anything, but we want to give them the option. And one of the latest things I had to bring up is the fact that we offer tallit to people before they go into our sanctuary. And that only started rather recently. And it's, and there were very few people who would come to services with their own tallit and then take them and put it on. And but we offer it. And there's a question of what kind of message are you sending when you're offering it? Are you saying it's because we're egalitarian and it's an option and you can do it? Or is there a concern we're becoming too conservative? We're offering something that takes us away from the classical Jewish environment. And is that good for Judaism and is that good for Temple Beth-El? And so I find this whole thing to be really interesting in terms of even how we make decisions within our temple to make changes.
Yeah, yes, that is, thank you for highlighting that, Nina, and one additional thing that I wanna say about that kind of to help deepen maybe the understanding of how decisions are made in our movement. This is another way where the reform context differs from the conservative context. So in Reformed communities, remember our philosophical principle is individual autonomy. So that applies to the individual, on the individual level, and it also applies on the congregational level. So different, Reformed congregations will look differently, and make decisions differently and whatnot. Some, communities like Temple Beth-El will have a strong worship committee that like makes decisions like this, others won't. But in the conservative movement, there is a general principle that the rabbi of the congregation is the Mara Da'atra. That means the Mara Da'atra is like what it means is it's like the rabbi is in charge of rituals. So in a conservative congregation, there might be a worship committee, but their role would not be to make decisions about the ritual practices. That's why they hire them. And it's the rabbi's job to decide how are we going to do things, what's in accord with the principles of conservative Judaism and halakha, and to lead the congregation in that way. That also leads to different outcomes, different ways of doing things, and you can argue, make a case, I think, for either way. I have opinions, which I'm not going to share, but nevertheless, that it's all of this goes in Feinstein's community, of course, it's without question, the rabbi makes the decision. So it's interesting in terms of like what you're saying, Nina, about like how does a community evolve in its practice? What factors are considered, when decisions are made, and how does the community lead toward not only to where, like for the present moment, toward the future. Was there another hand? Nellie, you had your hand? No? Bonnie.
I think that's great. I had no idea
What?
that we offer Talib for service.
It's been for a lot of years.
Wow.
How many years?
I'm impressed.
Well, that's why you don't know.
Reference, they're either hanging upstairs outside the temple. Also downstairs, we now have them hanging outside the doors. And also the key pods have been in that piece of furniture right near the door.
That's great.
So that's been at least for the last 25 years.
Is that
Say, thought process.
Yeah.
In a conservative temple then. Say that the rabbi is there for 5-10 years and retires, decides to move on, so on. And there is a new rabbi coming in. When they do their rabbi search, are they looking to just, fun thought game? Are they looking to possibly change? Are they looking to make sure that that rabbi then conforms with the way?
I mean, I would imagine they're looking for whatever they want to look for, but when a conservative congregation hires a rabbi, the social contract, and I believe it's even stated in the principles of the synagogue and probably the rabbinic contract, the rabbi is the Mara. Ritual decisions lie with the rabbi. So they would interview, I'm sure, accordingly, but nevertheless, when a conservative synagogue hires a rabbi, the laity cannot overrule the rabbi's decisions in respect to ritual. Yeah, Courtney.
But isn't it, when you join a synagogue, and we have quite a few just on a block alone, we have shared values, and that will attract a certain, people who have the same thinking, the same ideologies, the same beliefs, and what they feel would be, what they're comfortable with, what they would like to see in the synagogue. So it's, I think more instead of there being division, I think if it's like a softer disagreement.
How do you mean?
Like if let's just say, won't be like, okay, women can wear tallit or they can't, like so black and white.
Yeah,
We join temple where it's like, well, it's an option, you have nothing more, but there's something about it.
yeah,
But it doesn't become like that focal point of like we are divided, and you choose temple, I think, based on any organization.
where you feel.
We have a
Yeah.
shared values.
Definitely, yeah, 50.
Yeah, excuse me for bringing this up, but speaking of that, and the change of rabbis, we have belonged to the synagogue for many years when it was Rabbi Davidson who was the rabbi, and the services were in English. And when I was deciding whether, which synagogue to rejoin, because I heard there was a change, whatever. What is it? I think you should go to Temple Beth-El because you know that the services are in English. A former candidate that, the reform movement is going more conservative, that this is not just Temple Beth-El.
Yes.
This is what's going on. Yes.
Yeah, well, look at that, look at our prayer book, as you see, like, as we get it, deeper into it. You see the changes. That's the prayer book. And even, our prayer book has on the question of the Talit, I mean, the movement has staked out some ground in its prayer book. The prayer for, the blessing for putting on a Talit is right there at the beginning of the morning service. And it says at the top, for those who wear a Talit. So, I mean, in the Union prayer book, from classical Reform Judaism, that wasn't. So things, kind of. All right, so Susan and then Mark.
I was just curious about what is the relationship in Great Neck, among the three type, the conservative orthodox? Do you get together? Do you listen to other people's views? Does it influence, the rabbi, or just, how does that work?
I don't know that it works in any particular way, but
I would think that it's important, even though this is what I feel comfortable with. I think it's very important to understand and accept what other people
yeah,
think.
I agree. I'm still new, I'm learning the landscape. I just, last week, I got together with Rabbi Isma from Young Israel. Had a great conversation with him, a really good guy, and, I enjoyed talking with him. I'm trying to build, relationships. I know, and of course, we're in a joint religious school with the conservatives and the God Temple Israel Great Neck, so we have a relationship with them.
Yeah.
And I know there's the practice of the rabbinic dialogue that happens once a year. I'm not sure when or if that's happening this year. I haven't heard about it, but I imagine it will. And I believe strongly in pluralism, and that's why we read things like Feinstein in this room. Like if I were to pluralist, or other rabbis who may not be, might say like it's not important for Reformed congregants to read Moshe Feinstein. Like, who cares? He's not speaking to us, and his principles don't matter to us, but I believe that it's important to learn different perspectives because they help us process our own and whatnot, but not everybody, sees it that way, and certainly, orthodox, what is the meaning of the word orthodox?
Like strict,
And but it doesn't mean strict.
Yeah.
Like, break down the word orthodox. What does it mean? Like, not specifically in reference to Judaism, but orthodox is a word. What does it mean?
Following
It's like
along.
orthopedic, it's the body.
What? Yeah, but what does orthopedics do to your body?
Bones, great bones.
No, I know, right? It's in order to do what?
Religion.
Or what if the orthopedist do an orthodontist, what do they do with your teeth?
Right, right.
All right, so. And docs. They're docs. I'll stop it there. What does docs mean? Doxology, it means belief. Okay, so orthodox, great belief. So orthodox means like there's a correct belief. There's a correct way, like orthodontist corrects your teeth. An orthopedist corrects your body. Or orthodoxy means a correct belief. So the underlying philosophy of anything that is an orthodoxy, now I'm not talking about Orthodox Judaism with a capital O specifically, but anything orthodoxy means that there is a right way.
Right.
So orthodoxy is by definition not pluralistic.
Right.
Pluralism means there's more than one right way. Okay, so orthodox rabbis, and like my Orthodox colleague back in Omaha. Said to me one time, he said, and a super nice guy, and we, had a good relationship and even did some study together, but he said, I am not a pluralist. Okay, so his viewpoint was we did some joint educational things or whatever, but in putting together those programs, his terms were there were certain things that we couldn't talk about in our programs, because in his view, it was not acceptable to talk about, for instance, revelation. Revelation is like, it means a question of like, where does the Torah come from? Okay, like for him, the Orthodox belief is the Torah came from God at Mount Sinai. He had no interest or saw no benefit in like exposing his congregants to the idea that the Torah was written by human beings. Because in his view, like that's out of bounds. That's wrong. Okay. Whereas for me as a pluralist, I think it's great to expose, all of you to different ideas of revelation. But that's where we're different. And incidentally, one second, I want to say, like apropos of the question of classical Reform Judaism and like holding true. I believe, and I think like there's a very reasonable and strong case to me, that classical Reform Judaism was an orthodox. Okay? An orthodox with a lowercase o, which says like, we do this, we do not do this. Okay? So like, people say like, Reform Jews do not wear a tallit. That is orthodox with a lowercase o. Okay? Whereas Reform Judaism today is not an orthodoxy, it's pluralistic, meaning that there are different ways that people might choose to be reformed. Mark had his hand up. We have to finish. Yeah.
I'm sorry, real quick, along the lines of what you said before. Orthodox versus Reform, have to versus want to. And then you mentioned that in conservative, what the rabbi said, it basically goes, he overrules the language. The thing that thinking about my time here at Beth-El, when we pay your dues to go to any synagogue, whether it's here or Young Israel or anywhere, you know that it's not a democracy. Okay, and you know that you can make any suggestion you want. So isn't it true in a Reformed synagogue as well, that what the rabbi says goes?
No, not necessarily. In some foundations, I mean, where I did my associateship, yes. The senior rabbi ruled the roost, okay, and there was no question, nobody questioned her in that way. But that is not institutionalized, and that's the difference. In a conservative synagogue, the role of the rabbi as Mara Da'atra is institutionalized, it's formal. Okay, that's a part of the governance of the synagogue. Whereas in a Reformed synagogue, it's not. It's all about the relationship between the rabbi and the laity and how that's negotiated. So then it looks different in different places. All right, so we're gonna stop here. I'm sorry. I know there's lots of more comments, but we'll pick up next week and we're gonna move on. We're done with Talit now. We spent a good time on Beer Castellina. I believe the next thing in there is filling. So that's good. We'll tackle it up. All right, everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a great day.
Wonderful class, Rabbi. Interesting, very interesting.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Rob.